Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Hello, and thanks for tuning in. This episode is a little unique as we've published it as an audio podcast as usual, but we've also published the video. And thanks to one of our guests, Daryl, who you'll hear more about in a moment, we were able to record the video so that it shows all four of us simultaneously throughout the conversation, which I know some folks prefer. The audio version is available on our website, Apple Podcasts, and all the usual places, and you can find the video version on our YouTube channel, which you can find by searching for Thought Stretchers Education YouTube. As you may know, I've been experimenting with these salon-style discussions with multiple guests, and I truly enjoyed this one. We enter the conversation with only the simple idea to unpack some of the nuances and complexities of DEI, or DEIJ as they tend to call it overseas. And salon discussions aren't generally about persuasion, but an opportunity to understand the thinking of others and a chance to be better understood. I do wish we had a bit more time, but as you'll hear, one of the guests is a school principal and had other commitments at the top of the hour. I feel like we only scratched the surface, and perhaps we'll schedule a part 2. I'd like to remind you that you can find all of our professional development and learning options at our website, which is, of course, at wegrowteachers.com. In this conversation, you'll hear me refer to the concept of objective pluralism, and that's an important part of one of our professional learning options, which seeks to help schools and teachers reestablish or grow a better understanding of Enlightenment liberal principles and a reality-based community, which I think is highly related to DEI work. If you're interested in that or any of our PD options like project-based learning, knowledge-rich inquiry, differentiated instruction, and more, you can find them on our website in the school workshops and services area. And of course, you can find all of our blog content and this podcast there as well. That again is wegrowteachers.com. Normally, I have my guests introduce themselves as part of the conversation, but in the interest of time, I asked them to share a brief bio with me, and I'd like to take a moment to read those now. Carlos Hoyt is a licensed independent clinical social worker with a PhD in social work. He is a Black racialized immigrant, having come to America from Puerto Limon, Costa Rica when he was 4 years old. Carlos provides psychotherapy to children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families, and education, training, coaching, and consultation on matters related to social identity, social bias, and social justice to individuals and organizations seeking to realize their inclusivity aspirations. Through his research, writing, teaching, training, and speaking, Carlos invites clients and audiences to scrutinize master narratives of identity, including the dominant discourse on race, with the goal of illuminating and virtuously disrupting the racial worldview and reductive identity constructs in general. Carlos's first book, The Arc of a Bad Idea, Understanding and Transcending Race, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. He has written peer-reviewed articles on racism and spirituality and contributed an essay on empathy and a compendium of writings on peace psychology. Carlos has appeared on several podcasts and informational videos, providing insights and guidance on topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and racialization, including a TEDx talk charting a course beyond racism, which is definitely thought-stretching, and his ideas about race and the U.S. Census were recently featured in the Washington Post and Celeste Headley's Hear Me Out. Carlos's most recent book, and you'll hear me refer to this one in this conversation, is Diversity Without Divisiveness, a Guide to DEI Practice for K-12 Education from Routledge Publishing. Daryl Sinclair is an experienced international school leader and geography specialist with over 15 years of teaching experience, including a decade in international contexts. I first met Daryl when he was teaching in a school in Hamburg, Germany that I was helping with project-based learning. He's passionate about moving beyond reductivist labels toward equitable outcomes for all. Daryl believes that DEIJ is what we do, a philosophy that drives his work as a consultant, educator, and avid learner. He's currently based in northern Germany, and he collaborates with NEASC on strategies to support belonging in their associate schools, serves on the editorial board of the Teaching Geography Journal, and hosts the DEIJ Hot Takes podcast, of which I was a guest there some time ago. Daryl is dedicated to supporting meaningful and intentional collaboration within the equity space to support transformations of learning communities. Nunana Nyomi is a third culture kid of Ghanaian and American heritage and is passionate about inclusion. He is currently a secondary principal at Ecolinks Campus de Nations. He has led numerous workshops on DEIJ. Previously, he served as DEIJ coordinator at Layson American School and co-chaired the International School Anti-Discrimination Task Force. Nunana also worked with the Council of International Schools, supporting student transitions and promoting inclusion. He has also worked in higher education, directing international student admissions. With an MA in lifelong education from my alma mater, Michigan State University, go green, and a BA in international relations from Calvin University, he enjoys exploring intercultural connections. As always, please reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with any comments, questions, ideas, or concerns. I'd love to hear feedback or thoughts from this conversation. And of course, we'll share this on social media and you can comment there as well. And now here's our conversation. I am with an esteemed panel here to have a good, hopefully, discussion, salon discussion on DEI, or as at least Daryl says, DEIJ, kind of like math and maths. They like to put weird, appendages on things, but happy to have the conversation. And I will have already done some introductions, hopefully accurately, but let's get going here with a limited amount of time. And Carlos, I'd like to ask you to get us started. You are the author of a new book, Diversity Without Divisiveness, a guide to DEI practice for K-12 educators. I'll hold it up here. Well worth the read. And I'd like to ask you to kind of talk about how you see DEI, what you think it should look like, and maybe any comments on what it is looking like, at least in the United States, from this point of view.
Sure. First of all, thanks, Drew, for putting this together. And I'm just so, inspired and impressed and happy to be on with Nona and Daryl. So thank you all. I try very hard these days to try to find some common ground, in these divisive times. So whatever it is we're talking about, my hope is, it's not always futile. Sometimes I guess it is, but my hope is, even if we seem to disagree seriously, is there some kernel of ground we can stand on and say, well, at least we agree on that. So regarding DEI, it has obviously been tarred and feathered and manipulated and sort of made into something that actually stands for division by some folks who have an agenda that actually has nothing to do with what they say it has to do with. And I'd like to pull back and see if there's anything that we can all agree on regarding DEI. And I think the easiest things to agree on are the things that are indisputable, just logically or empirically. So when I talk about DEI, I try to begin by giving everybody a chance to realize that DEI exists as long as human beings exist. I'll actually take what we're doing right now. Drew, you were engaged in some DEI, when you decided to put this program together. You thought about what range of people, what variety of backgrounds and perspectives might be useful. That's diversity, that's the big D. Before we even start to record, you were talking about ways to make sure that we all get a chance to say what we need to say. That's equity, trying to make sure we get some equal ear time and a chance to represent what's important to us. And, you even volunteered to let us sort of ask some of the questions. We can kind of be in charge and share this with you. And that's inclusion, right? We have a voice and a say in what happens. And I invite people to walk through their day and realize how often they are doing DEI, in terms of who's coming to the party, who we're inviting to the wedding, what school we go to, what neighborhood we live in. Those are all DEI determinations. We can't get away from it. That means that for anybody to say they're against DEI, should cause us to raise an eyebrow and say, well, that's not even possible. right? That's a DEI statement in and of itself, because all they really mean is they are against what I call DEI expansivism, right? A DEI that says everybody's included. If you're a human being and you can civilly and peacefully express yourself, then you should have a place in the community, and we should try to make sure there's as much parity and equity as possible in terms of your inclusion in the community. DEI restrictivists, on the other hand, and that's one of the ways that I characterize the regime that we're facing right now, is not that they're against diversity, they just shrink diversity to a very small group of people. I'm happy to see that more and more folks aren't afraid to sort of call that what it is, which is white supremacism, right? And male supremacism, which sort of go together. So that is a kind of diversity. It just doesn't extend to everybody on the screen right now, right? And it doesn't extend to female identified people. And I'm not sure it's going to extend to anybody, beyond those who are not just white, racialized, and male, but actually have a certain class, as well. I'm not sure you have to be a billionaire, but, it helps to be, well financed. So the struggle is not against, folks who are for DEI and folks who are against DEI. It's about whether or not this country is going to try to live up to what it said it wanted to, which is DEI expansivism. Right? That's what the struggle to come from England to come here was actually all about. Let's make a place where we're all represented, not all that high-flying rhetoric that we don't always live up to, right? We all know that too. But in terms of a basis that no one can argue with, that's actually what democracy is supposed to be about. So now we have, and we've always had a tension between the expansivism and the restrictivism, but suddenly we put in power people who are absolutely, without any sort of joking about it, any hiding about it, restrictivists. And it happens day by day that they're saying, you don't count, we're not going to fund this, we're going to threaten you over there, like do what we want, give us what we want, or there'll be trouble. Right? And that's kind of where we are in terms of what I consider DEI these days.
Well, thanks for that. And you've made some interesting distinctions, and I certainly want to get into the expansive and restrictive. And you and I have talked before as I've tried to have conversations with lawmakers and folks who are pushing back against some of the DEI measures. Certainly something I think we will talk about here. And I'm curious to hear more about the restrictive and expansive kinds of things, because I think I maybe have been misusing them as from what I'm hearing the way you talking about it. But how do you think about it? Are there any distinctions? You're in Switzerland. You, as we were talking before we started recording, you have lived all over the globe, it sounds like. You're working as a principal in a school and head of a school. And so what are the distinctions that you might make to build upon what Carlos said there?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of parallels with a lot of what Carlos said. And so I'll try to build upon that and share some additional perspective within that. Of course, I'm thinking about my own school context, thinking about the international context as well, which is obviously not removed from everything that's happening also in the United States and in the ways in which, we are interconnected. I think about a friend of mine, Angeline Au, who wrote a book called Becoming a Totally Inclusive School. And she often will ask the question, what is the main purpose of a school? And typically, when you search deeply and you try to look at the real purpose beyond everything else, it's really to keep students safe. That's really the first primary purpose. If you don't have that, if you don't have safety, we can't then learn. We can't then, build upon that for success. So for me, when I think about DEI and I think about the way forward and especially these divisive times and think about how do we find ways to create common ground, I strive for really stripping it back to the basics and saying, do we have safety for our students? Do we have safety for those in our care, our staff members, others within the community? And if the answer is that no, there are some people who are truly not feeling 100% safe within the community, whether it's because of a certain aspect of their identity or, whatever it might be, then there's still work that needs to be done. And that's where DEI work comes in, where we try to find ways to be inclusive, where we try to find ways to make sure that the voices are represented, that there's agency, that there's a sense of flourishing, of thriving within the community. So start with safety. I also think about the idea of keeping things very local to the space that you might be in. So I know this is a very, it's a political time. I think you can't divorce the idea of diversity and inclusion from politics. But I maintain, as some have said, that all politics is local first. And so you have to think about what's going on around your community, again, around who's enfranchised, who seems to be getting the voice, who doesn't. And what does that say about how systems are created? Another friend, Daniel Wickner, kind of came up with a list of the ways in which schools are created. And schools are collections of systems, whether it's hiring practices, whether it's the scheduling system, whether it's, the curriculum that's chosen, all the different ways in which things are taught or things are delivered, information is delivered. It's all part of a system, and how those systems are created either can be systems of empowerment where everyone feels like they can rise, or the people that are enfranchised feel like they can rise, or they become systems of oppression where the systems aren't created equitably, inclusively in a way that people can really contribute. So again, you have to think locally about your systems and what are you doing personally? What is your sphere of influence to address issues? So again, it's about to create this idea that we are all trying to strive to create a community where we can truly belong. And in order to do that, we start with safety. We start to look at our local context, our sphere of influence, how we can manage that. And then for me, the last principles that I'd share is this idea of kind of us being bound together. So this is something from Michelle Mi-Jung Kim. She cited in her book, The Wake Up, cited this this Aboriginal proverb that talks about how, if you're coming to essentially save me, I'm really not interested. But if you are here because our liberation is bound together, then we have a basis for conversation. So this isn't some kind of a saviorist situation, but it's really something where if you feel like you truly can't be happy and thrive without the other person, then there's still work that needs to be done. I think Tim Wise also shared a bit about this when he talks about white supremacy as well. This whole idea that you can't truly flourish and truly enjoy the fruits if there are others who aren't enjoying or having the same access, because there's something that's missing there. There's a bit of humanity that's lost there. And so then we have a responsibility then to do something about it. But beyond just taking the responsibility to do something about it, it's also being really, it's kind of this idea of losing something, that you're not really fully whole, that you lose culture. In the case of the US context, if you're simulating in some kind of proverbial whiteness, so to speak, then you're missing out on what it means to be truly, a part of your identity. Maybe that European country that you're part of, that specific culture that you're part of, you're not able to highlight it as much because you feel you kind of fall into a general white Americanness, so to speak. So to me, those are the main things: safety, local focus, kind of remaining in your sphere of influence, and then thinking about how we're all bound together.
Okay, great. Daryl, you've been waiting patiently, and I'd like to hear your perspective and how you might build upon that.
Well, I'm going to try and build upon
on both things which have been shared so far. I think so far, I really love what you've said, Carlos, with regards to the idea of the fact that if we, in the most broad definition of DEI, it's something which is taking place on the most granular level in almost everything we do. Anything we do where we are involving other people, there is some consideration of who's represented, who's invited, who's speaking, who's not speaking, so on and so forth. And then, as someone who's also a fan of Angeline Au's work, the foundational concept of safety and, building upon that, the ability to flourish, the ability to belong. I'm going to try and be relatively concise here, but when it comes to DEI, we pointed out at the beginning the idea of, having DEIJ. I will say for all the use of labels to identify externally, I'm a firm believer of a rose by any other name smells just as sweet. So as I'm reading between the lines with what's been shared so far, one of the key concepts within DEI is the impact or the outcomes that we're seeking for it to have, which is generally people's safety, people's ability to belong, to be agential and contribute to decisions which are being made, which affect them, so on and so forth, all of the different pieces of this. But looking at what DEI might mean today and some of the narratives that we've seen in the discourse where we've seen something of a backlash, both on a very large scale, on a national scale, and also on quite an interpersonal level. And I think this kind of speaks to the history of what, again, I'm going to broadly term DEI work, but would fall under global citizenship or social justice work or civil rights movement, so on and so forth. But we've gone through a period of time over the past 200 years. I'm not going to go into lots and lots of granular detail and quoting dates, but broadly, we've gone through a period of time where we've seen distinct and very intentional and legally driven segregation of people, to the point whereby one of the best ways of resisting that oppression was for people to congregate under the labels and the identities that they were given. We see the birth of Black advocacy groups. We see the birth of feminine movements, LGBTQ+. But as we've come into the 2000s, there's been in my opinion and my reading of it and the last 15 plus years I've spent in schools, we've seen a slight shift whereby in forming those groups in order to resist and advocate for oneself, it's led to both what we might consider the extreme right and the extreme left, almost aiming for the same outcomes, where we are further categorizing people and people are further segregating themselves by the labels that they were either given or they're now choosing. But one of the byproducts of that now for DEI work is within that and the speak about white supremacy and the strength of the identities which have been formed by people sinking deeper and deeper into their national identities, cultural identities, religious identities, so on and so forth. We've had this phenomena of the birth of a incredibly popular and incredibly toxic masculinity, which is most strongly associated with young men who would be racialized as white. And when I speak to these students at my school, I was having a conversation with Michael Neumann about this at the ECIS conference recently, where we've got this collection of people who are in all considerations of DEI work and looking into white supremacy would be considered hegemonical. They are at the top. But they have watched all of these identities create these pockets and communities where they can advocate for themselves, while simultaneously the people at the top haven't had that. They haven't had a distinct concept of white culture. And thus we're seeing this outcry, this reaching for some form of identity that can be latched onto. We're seeing advocacy groups being born in different organizations. There'll be the LGBTQ+, there'll be Black, there'll be Latinx, there'll be this, there'll be that. And then you're literally seeing a group of people racialized as white saying, well, where do we go? And I think this is where we get into, from my perspective, reading Carlos's definitions of expansive and restrictive.
we've got this restrictive DEI where on both sides of those who may be considered the most far left and those considered the most far right, where both groups believe that we need to be categorized under very distinct identity labels, which are, in truth and honesty, incredibly generalizing and do not give space for individual expression and self-realization. One of the key psychological factors of being able to belong and being able to have the feeling of agency in your life. Whereas what I believe DEI expansionism is moving away from those labels, is where I've worked with schools where they've had a feminine advocacy group, and they've had the young men in the group or in the school turn around and say, well, there's Women's Month, there's Black History Month, when's it Men's Month? Why aren't we learning about that? And rather than turning around and saying, oh, we're going to make a men's advocacy group, they go, why don't we come together and learn together? And perhaps they'll do something like a gender studies group. Or they'll have a look at something which becomes more inclusive rather than doing this progressive separatism of everyone needs to be with their own people to create their own identity, when that is actually further forcing people into the labels which are the labels under which they're oppressed. So for me, the modern expressions of DEI, where we see it being restrictive, is that adherence to distinct categories for people, whether that's done through a progressive lens or a conservative lens. Whereas expansionist DEI is where it becomes truly inclusive, and we begin to look at people not through a lens of immutable characteristics, you are this, but more so that let's learn about each other, let's learn what we want, what we need, who we are, and a more granular concept, like Nunana was saying, starting from the local. Who am I? The most local. And then building forward from there rather than grand labels and then trying to self-realize within that.
Well, thank you for that. And so I'd like to maybe share a little bit about how I think about it, and then, let's just kind of open it up. When I was on your hot takes video, one of the things that I shared was my advocacy for what I call objective pluralism, enlightenment, liberal principles, that pluralistic kind of approach that I think gets at what you're talking about there, insofar as we want to recognize that there are a variety of perspectives or a variety of identities, all these kinds of things. But, and Carlos, this is where I maybe am using restrictivist or restrictive DEI and expansionist maybe a little bit differently than I thought maybe you were. When I think about DEI, my distinctions that I'm trying to make with folks who are legally attacking it and trying to shut it down, saying we have to abolish and get rid of DEI, I say we have to get rid of really poorly done DEI. And to me, the expansive DEI is one that really acknowledges that pluralistic view. And I think it was Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in Coddling an American Mind, I may be wrong about this, but talk about getting, instead of drawing smaller circles, and I think, Daryl, that's what you're kind of getting at, the smaller circles, which aren't unimportant, right? We want to certainly recognize people's identities and backgrounds and all of those kinds of things, but that we are advocating for and directionally moving towards drawing larger circles of that inclusiveness. And my insistence is that expansive DEI would do that would insist on those sort of enlightenment liberal principles that bring in those kinds of principles. And restrictive DEI, and this is maybe where some of the backlash comes from, some, not all, gets at the ways in which some DEI folks have really done what I would say is more restrictive of finding those identities and really withdrawing into those identities in a way that I think is in some ways hostile to those enlightenment liberal principles. So I'm curious how you all think about those kinds of things.
Yeah, I already love this conversation, so thank you all. Drew, I appreciate your humility and wondering if you're sort of using those terms the same way I am. And I think you are. And jump in if I'm sort of getting you wrong, but I would say that part of what we call DEI's challenge is to do expansive DEI well. I think attempts to include everybody, aren't always done properly. And I always throw up a hand when I see an article or something that says, wow, this was done poorly. I say, well, maybe it was, right? There's no profession, that's perfect, and certainly not this one. I sometimes say to folks who are promoting that all DEI is bad, I say, well, how do you feel about it when we say that all cops are bad? And I don't even have to say anymore. They sort of get it. Like if especially if they are conservative identified, right? If it's not okay to, just broad stroke, all the police in the world, we probably shouldn't do that with anything, including DEI practitioners.
You mean distinctions matter? What?
Exactly. So restrictivism for me, I wouldn't so much put the practice of DEI expansivism in there. I would say restrictivism is actually an ideology that says like you are not in the group, right? You're not in the broader group of human beings who we think are deserving of these things we have to give out, right? That's a whole different thing, and I think that's what we're facing. But even for those of us who are trying to uphold expansivism, there are good practices and there are not such good practices, right? Daryl, I want to say that I completely agree with your assessment of where we are in terms of the arc of doing social identity. I do think for really understandable reasons, we have come to a place where like hunkering down in one social identity because one is targeted based on one's social identity and how they are perceived is kind of where we are. And that makes sense to me in terms of human psychology. But it's also problematic, right? Because it does lead to what you were saying. It's a sort of it's a recapitulation of the very thing we're trying to get out of, right? Which is drawing a circle around one small group, to use your phrase, Drew, of drawing circles, and saying, well, those other people either need to take care of themselves, or as a matter of fact, we better watch out for them. So we've gone a bit too far, I think, in terms of social identity category entrenchment. It's Spivak, I think, who coined the term strategic essentialism, where on the one hand, and she speaks a lot to sort of women's issues and women's studies, I can philosophically, logically say that, there's no thing as a quote unquote woman, because, we can keep defining it, redefining it, et cetera. On the other hand, when they're coming at us, in terms of, gender politics and discrimination, we probably should fight back. What do we fight back on the basis of? We fight back on the basis of women's rights, right? So it's very complicated. And I think we have to forgive ourselves, for that complexity. It's hard to resist it. And I tend to say to folks, well, it sort of becomes a both and, right? You don't have time to sit everybody down in a classroom where they're saying you can't have the same pay, or we're actually going to come and, take away your rights, et cetera. You have to say, we are X and we are proud. And it becomes a sort of reclaiming of identity. And I say that even in the civil rights movement, right, which I owe my career and possibly my life to, if we're going to be honest with each other, I would say that, that was a moment where we should have disclaimed difference instead of reclaiming difference. Now I think folks in that era are to be forgiven. We didn't have the kind of knowledge we have around genetics and, what makes human beings the same, et cetera, et cetera. We weren't as clear about race and racialization, but we can do that now. And I'm getting impatient, I guess, for us to catch up with that. We are still stuck in racial equal rights, for example. And I tend to say to folks, well, that's an oxymoron, right? Race is predicated on the idea of us not being equal. For us to really have human rights, we have to disclaim that false difference. We can't have it both ways. And we've been trying to have it both ways for a long, long time. And again, I'm super sympathetic as to why that is. Like it's a survival issue for some reason, for some people. But it's also counterproductive, right? So I think we do have to move to a point, and I think schools are the place to do it. That's why I'm in education and I love education, where we give young people a chance to think a little bit differently. Not proselytize, not tell them how to think, but once given permission to do the logic of identity and inclusion, kids get there really quickly. I do lessons on racialization where I actually have kids make races out of human features. It could be eyebrows, ears, whatever. I say, just pick it, go for it. Separate people based on it. make attributions after that, essentialize it, and before you know it, you're discriminating against people because they have fixed or not fixed earlobes, right? That's what race is. I don't tell them what to think about their own, ascription or subscription to race. That's up to them after that. But up until that point where we've had that lesson, they haven't been given permission to think about it differently. So I do think there's some work we can do there. And that to me, Drew, is good DEI, right? But it's towards and it's in the service of expansivism. Let's get everybody in there.
I'm sorry, I got to jump in here. Carlos, I really love how you've positioned things there, and the vision of the school as the basis as a location to strongly challenge this. For myself in the work that I do with young people or have been doing, it's very much, a key point of identity formation, whereby we can either I don't want to use the word indoctrinate because then we'll get into another whole territory, but if we, I'm basing a lot of these thoughts on the work of Yasha Monk, who wrote The Identity Trap, Sheena Mason, The Raceless Anti-Racist. I've been absolutely loving conversations with her and reading her work this past year, but whereby we're looking at the idea of, if you introduce people to certain categories and identities, they will form their identities based off of that, without necessarily realizing that their identity labels will mean different things in every single part of the world, showing the fiction or the social construction of them. But to go even further than that, if we can take a strategically essentialist approach and we can, again, using romantic language, but it is appropriate language, in my opinion, to empower students to look at identity conceptually, not just as a in-group, out-group dynamic, not just as a sense of ownership. This is my identity, but looking at it through a lens of, what does it mean to have identity and what do I use identity for? Do I use it to decide how I treat people? Do I use it to engage with the world? Do I use it to discriminate? Do I use it to decide where I stand? What do I use identity for, and what do these identities mean? And as we get young people to explore that, it can really destabilize some of the more malicious outcomes, where we can begin to have people almost instinctively, when we hear a statement of X people are Y, and they go, but what does X people mean? Because one of the most challenging and perhaps conversation starting things that I'll say over the past few years, well, longer than that, but is where I say to people, oh, I don't actually identify as Black. I don't see it as intrinsic to who I am and my identity. I recognize fully that I'm racialized that way, that's the way that many people will view, label, and understand me. But it does not in any way, shape, or form represent who I am as an individual. So I don't use it as a basis of my identity or my basis of allegiance or alliance with others. And then that can give birth to a whole slew of questions. Literally, most recently, having someone say to me, well, if you don't identify as Black, then what are you? And for me, it was just like spotlight on the idea of how entrenched these ideas are. Because then I turned around and said, well, what does Black mean to you? Long silence. So then how can you ask me to use that as an identity? So sorry, I've rambled a bit there, but I'm really enjoying this.
I don't consider it rambling at all. And Nunana, I'm sorry, I'll let you speak in just a moment. Especially want to hear, because you're a principal. First of all, thank you for doing that job. That's not an easy job to do. So the idea of asking somebody who they are, and then using that as a proxy for all sorts of, file cabinet full of assumptions about the person, is something that I do hope we can start to invite people to move away from. I have a 3-hour workshop with a bunch of teachers in July, and I'm starting to map it out a little bit, and I'm hoping to spend like the last hour on something I want to call like, let's do some time travel and go to the future. At some point, I hope that all of us as teachers will be, instead of doing that exercise with our classroom where we say like, what's your identity? Tell us all about it. Let's sit with each other and answer the question, what are your identifications? What do you believe in? What do you stand for? Right? What are your principles? What are your worldviews? And heritage can be in there too. But it's not this restrictive sense of you are one of, I don't know, 9 or so categories of social identity. And once I know that, I know you. So and you may know this about me, Daryl, I also say I have no use for race in terms of my own personal identity. I am a adversely racialized Black male in this society and in this country, but that's on other people. That's how they see me. I want to disclaim that as a real difference. Right? But I'm more than happy to say with people, I believe in this. I stand for that. And if you do too, then we have a lot in common, that maybe tracks racially and culturally and ethnically because of how we're socialized. But that's not really what it's about. It's about the choices I've made as an agentic being. It's not something essential to this pigment that I happen to be in. And again, I know that if we give kids a chance to think about that, they will get there quickly. Adults, not so much, and certainly adults who have a sort of a sneaky agenda to just sort of rule the world, they don't want to get there, even if they're pretending they want to get there. All right, I'll be quiet now too.
This is a really, certainly fascinating discussion, and reminds me of some conversations I know Daryl and I have had too around this topic. And, where I kind of sit, particularly on the racialized aspect, is, I wonder if there's a both and scenario here, where we want to make sure that we're being expansivist, that people shouldn't be restricted to specific labels that just say, okay, this is your identity and therefore I know you, or therefore, you must fit a certain stereotype of what that looks like. So, certainly we want to do exercises like some of the things you were mentioning, Carlos, in terms of the exercises you've put students through. And I think those are really fascinating ones that I'd love to even maybe pinch from and try to get going within our community. At the same time, I also am maybe one of those people on maybe a slightly different part of the spectrum where I say it's important for me to do a bit of reclaiming also, around certain labels of identities, because there's an element of it that can allow for celebration. So when I think about the civil rights movement, for instance, and or maybe maybe even a bit further along as we look at a James Brown song saying "I'm Black and Proud," for instance, there is something within that where you still want to capture that magic of saying, you know what, we are going to flip the script. And we're not just going to stick with whatever society has defined as what Black might be, but also claim all the aspects of that also are really positive and strong contributions, and embrace the fact that society is trying to use a racialized definition on me. But let's turn that around for what good it can be also. And so that for me is important, and especially in a school where we're having people grappling with identity, teenagers trying to work through what does it really mean to be me. It's a time where we want to give them that agency, that ability to say, yeah, I do identify as this thing, and yeah, okay, that might be something that society may have bestowed upon me, but here's the aspects of it that I love about that. And how do we kind of foster that ability to celebrate that? And I believe that can also be expansive at the same time, because I worry that if we kind of we kind of completely reject labels, if we go that way, it almost falls into that trap of color blindness, so to speak. I'm not saying that either of you doing that, but in that space where people start to say, well, we don't see these differences that we have. And the reality of humanity is it's far more beautiful and vibrant than that. And I think we should be celebrating those elements of beauty. So I just think there's a way that we can do it that allows us to still capture that expansivism while also allowing people to claim certain labels that for them are important.
If I can respond, because I really enjoy, I think this speaks to the work that we're all doing, both and, rather than either or. Either or could be seen as explicitly restrictive and divisive. Both and is the inclusive version of that. I will say on one hand, my brain goes, if I am to reject the negative associations of a label due to the generalist approach it takes, then I would be causing myself cognitive dissonance to then accept the positives of it. But what's super important to me, Nunana, is what you said at the end, is where you said, for me to use the labels, the labels that I identify with. And I think here we're seeing the marriage between, in all of the great works of identity. I unfortunately I don't have an immediate author to quote or a scientist to quote, but of all the reading of identity I've done from different traditions, it always has the tension between the self-born identity from within and the identity formed from our relationship with others. So whether that be Ubuntu, whether that be Buddhism, whether that be different interactions of self and other. So this idea that we can own labels and engage with them the way that our internal sense of self engages with them, and to have that sense of identity that we can shout out proudly. And I think there is so much space for that. And thank you for not assuming an approach of colorblindness, because most certainly not the direction I'm trying to go, but very cognizant of the risk. I think this is not a movement to eradicate labels, but to engage with them in a way which disarms their ability to reduce someone's options, abilities, and engagement with wider society and opportunities. But they can still be there. It's not that there needs to be, the word black should never be used, but it's more in the sense that it should never be empowered to prevent someone access to their life and their rights. And all the different versions of that. So thank you so much for how you clarified that.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. I always, especially when I'm working with, teenagers and middle schoolers who are very attached to their identities that they're developing, I make it clear that I'm not telling them what to do with their sense of blackness. It's all about them.
Mm-hmm.
But if we are going to honor our individuality, I'm going to be honest with them about how I think about it. And I want to share some perspective on how we got here. So I think I was a teenager at the time that Say It Loud came out, and I had the afro, believe it or not, and it was a heady moment. It's intoxicating, to have someone put a mirror up that says you're young, gifted, and black to you, and to have that, in your heart, when you're fighting all the oppression. I got that, and I still look back on that fondly. And these days I see it as part of the evolution of the resistance, right? The resistance to what? The resistance to social bias, right? No matter how it manifests. But let's stay on race for just a moment, right? So someone says to, a person in dark skin, whether it's in Africa or the very beginning, or, since we've been here, you are this and that is bad, right? The reflex is to say, this is not bad, right? Instead of sort of doing the critical thinking and saying, hold on now, you just said I'm something that doesn't even exist, right? I'm not going there. You're not going to trap me in that. Because one of the challenges around reclaiming identity is that it really only works for the folks who are reclaiming it. The folks who saw it and imposed it as something negative, they're not going with you. They don't believe that gay is now a positive term. Folks who are homophobic, they're still going to use it in a bad way. So while it does work, and I think it really does, for folks who are inside the marginalized, the victimized group, it doesn't change the dynamic. And in some ways, I kind of think that's when they have us, right? Because we've accepted and adopted and embraced the frame that they put on us. And I think the only way to sort of break the hold is to break the frame and say, we're doing not enough of that, right? There are not such intrinsic differences between males and females that we have a right, to discriminate against females. That's a grandmaster narrative that we are trying to get rid of. And I think the thing we call race is moving in the same direction. I do think it's both and, in that it's epigenetic, right? We can't in this very moment say we're done with race, we're only going to talk about racialization. I just ask people to consider expanding the discourse on race so that we can also study, realize, play around with this idea of racialization towards someday, I hope, the jargon being Black racialized, white racialized instead of Black. I just want to put a little bit of space between the identity and the phenomenon that brings it about. Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know Nunana's got to leave at the top of the hour. So as we talk about DEI and, Carlos, you mentioned things other than race, but we're not going to have time to get into lots of the things that we should or could and certainly would want to. The work of Sheena Mason that Daryl, you mentioned, and I'm a big fan of hers as well. She's got a new book, The Racist Anti-Racist, and folks should also look into Racecraft by the Field Sisters. It's really, really great work as well. I wonder about the ways in which you think about, and I think you mentioned strategic essentialism, sort of strategic non-essentialism. And when I think about and hear people who are really pushing back hard against DEI, there you go, Racecraft. One of the things, of course, that shows up in the policies and laws now is we don't want kids to feel bad about their race or their heritage or some versions of that, which to me is a version of racism, because when I hear about the things that people did in the past in the United States, slavery, who happened to be the same skin pigment of mine and perhaps some of my ancestors, I don't feel any responsibility. That's not something I did. So it's a strange intellectual move to be feeling bad about yourself and associating yourself with them. Again, that's odd to me. I wonder if it makes sense to think about when you talk about identifying as Black or racialized Black, or however you want to put it, and I tend to use racialized Black as well. I think it's important to say, like, what we want to recognize the history in the past and the effects there, and when we dismiss or don't use those identifiers, I think tends to do that. What does it look like now? But then what do we want it to look like in the future? And I think, Carlos, I think maybe all three of us, all four of us, is looking at a future where it's less about that skin color and it's less about those identifiers. So I'm wondering if that, past, present, and future sort of distinction helps in any way.
Different DEI for different times. I would say every version of what we can broadly categorize as DEI over the years has served some great benefit. So we might now look at the strategies used through the civil rights movements and be like, that's not appropriate for today. That's really broad language. I'm not going to die on that hill, and I don't firmly believe in that statement. But what I would say is we have a different context now, and I think in every DEI practitioner I've ever come across speaks in some way to the idea that it's an ongoing journey. It's not terminal. You don't solve it and then you're finished. But I think sometimes not enough attention is given to the fact that the reason for that is not some romanticization of it all and the never-ending lifelong learner and all that language. It is literally because as we respond to the new ways that we categorize and group each other and we engage with each other, new problems will arise and there will be a new knowledge base. We are now dealing with a society who's much more cognizant of these challenges and has an opinion on it. And that means we need to engage with it differently. And I think that's critically important. So looking towards the future, I don't want to be as reductivist to say what it would look like, but I can say that the direction that I would hope it would go is the reduction of the use of terms in immutable ways. So the idea that you are this and that defines you to the point whereby you are not allowed to break out of that box. I think a common analogy used by teachers, I do apologize, I've forgotten the name of the author, but she created the windows and, what was it? I think it's windows and doorways. Mirrors and windows. Thank you. And what went through my mind the first time I went through that work was you only need a window if there's a wall around you. So if we can break down those walls, which are the boxes that we're put in, then we don't need to have a window to see into other people and who they are and what they are and how they live. If we can do away with the really restrictive boxes that we've been continually putting ourselves in over the past decades and more.
That's a beautiful answer, Daryl. And Drew, I really appreciate the question. Daryl, at some point, I don't know, people probably added other features to that room too, but a door is sometimes used as well. Like, can I actually get out of here and go into some other space?
Yeah.
I'll just say briefly, because I know we're near the top of the hour. Drew, regarding the future, I talk a lot to people about us moving from myopic identity politics to anti-bias, right?
Mm.
Because the fact is, we're prone to put things in categories, we're prone to put things in hierarchies, and that can lead to a lot of great things, but it can also lead us to a lot of trouble. So how do we sort of embrace and sort of own that that's kind of part of our psychological architecture, and then find ways to be vigilant against it getting us into trouble? And if it's anti-bias, then that means like none of the isms, right? We have to be on guard, and there are ways to do that. So I'll just leave it there.
Well, I know we're at the top of the hour, Nunana. I want to give you the last word before you step out, and we'll wrap this up.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, I love what both you, Daryl and Carlos have shared about this future, and the ways in which we can set up our society. The idea of anti-bias, I think, is really, a good one in the sense that it kind of takes us back to the scientific of like, this is how we're hardwired. And so as we look at DEI for the future, it's, how do we look at ourselves and how we wire ourselves as human beings, mitigate for the areas in which where we can be prone to categorize people and put people in groups in nefarious ways. And as Daryl was talking about with this whole journey idea of it's really continuous improvement, that we're going to have to continue to do the work. And as we do the work, it's going to unveil new nuances and new issues that we're going to have to address. So for me, I think as we strive for the future, it's kind of the whole mosaic idea again, where they often will contrast a mosaic and a melting pot of, trying to create a society where, as I talked about this idea of celebrating the uniqueness within the individuals that are there, and truly to the both end, this idea of that people's own self-identification are things that we can honor, appreciate, value, so that they can truly be their best selves. So to me, I think it's trying to create and strive for that type of, mosaic approach where people can really flourish as individuals within a larger collective society.
Well, I want to honor your time, Nunana. I know you're a busy man with the principalship, so I'll just wrap it up by saying thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. Thanks for having me.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.